Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the final day of the Foundation Future Leaders Conference 2020. On Tuesday, we looked at how science is used in government and the importance of government having access to evidence and expertise. Yesterday, we focused on business, both small and large, and looked at how science and technology is used to develop new products and processes. And on this third and final day, we're looking at science, technology, and research in universities. As with the last 2 days, if you're tweeting, and we very much encourage you to do so, please do tag us at @FoundSciTech and use the hashtag FSTLeaders. Now, most of you have now seen this slide, in some cases twice, but just to remind you about the technology, we're using the Zoom in the webinar function. Please ask your questions using the Q&A function, and you can find the button for that at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions, but you can also comment on other people's questions and upvote questions. And the advantage of upvoting is that the chair can use that to see which questions she should ask. So let me introduce you to the chair for today's meeting. Today, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Rebecca Widderfield, who is Chief Executive of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Rebecca, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gavin, and let me join Gavin in welcoming you all to this third day of the Foundation Futures Leaders Conference. The title for today's session is Science, Technology and Research in Universities, and the idea of today's session is to explore how universities work, how science is conducted and by whom, and how universities make links with business and government. And I think against the backdrop of COVID, I can't think of a more important and a more relevant and pertinent topic than those ones. In terms of the format of today's session, we're going to begin with a keynote presentation by Professor Dame Nancy Rothwell, and then followed by a panel session. At the start of the panel session, I'll ask each of the panelists to give a brief introduction and intervention, and I'll introduce them at the time. We'll then move into a question and answer session, and as Gavin said, we'll be using the Q&A function in Zoom, so please do feel free to start asking questions as soon as the event starts. But now, without further ado, let me introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Dame Nancy Rothwell, who's a Fellow of the Royal Society. Professor Dame Nancy Rothwell is President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Manchester. She joined the Victoria University of Manchester in 1987, became Professor of Physiology in 1994, and held numerous roles at the university before becoming President and Vice Chancellor in July 2010. And Dame Nancy was the first woman to lead the University of Manchester, or indeed either of its two predecessor institutions. She is currently co-chair of the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology and on numerous boards, including the Greater Manchester Local Enterprise Partnership Board and the Northern Powerhouse Partnership Board. She was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in June 2004 and made Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in June 2005. I can't think of anyone better to speak to us around science, technology and research in universities. So Dame Nancy, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be speaking to future leaders. The topic could be a huge one, but I'm just going to try and summarise a few thoughts around the concepts of universities, science and technology. And I want to begin by just saying I'm speaking generally about universities. I can give a few comments on my own university, the University of Manchester, but don't want to focus on that. I think we've been in the news enough in recent days. But I'm also chair of the Russell Group of Universities, the 24 universities that are very research intensive, though of course there are others as well. So let me begin with something which I think is fundamental and not that well understood, which is what are universities? And here I use universities in the UK context because they are different in other parts of the world. And more importantly, the question of what are universities for? What's our purpose? Of course, we are places of learning, inquiry, scholarship, where we develop new knowledge, we apply that knowledge, we work with numerous stakeholders, as I'll come back to in a moment. But we are also there, I believe, as charities, independent charities. We are not public sector, we're not private. But I think overall, what universities are for public benefit. Whether that public benefit is through our discoveries and their applications, and in this current time, of course, you'll have heard of many of the discoveries that are relevant to COVID-19. We're there for public benefit through those that we train, who become future leaders, such as I hope you will be. We also have a key role in our local communities, and that of course depends in part on geography, but to me in Manchester, that's an extremely important part of what we do. Our community engagement, the role of civic universities, the role of universities in their local region. Fundamental issues about universities that are different to some other organisations and that I believe are core to our missions are academic freedom and freedom of speech. And let me just say what that means, because at times it is misinterpreted. Of course, we're all guided by regulations, by principles and so on, but in the end, it is down to academics about what they research, what they teach. And I think universities play an important role in wider challenge. And that challenge may be political, it may be social, but it's also very important in spanning some divides. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Of course, universities are each independent. They are in competition with each other to some extent, but they also often work collectively. And here the Russell Group does work together on many aspects and shares many principles and ideas and communications. There are also many instances of universities working together either locally, nationally, or internationally. One of the interesting benefits of COVID, and I'm, as an optimist, always looking for some benefits, although they seem rather few at the moment, is that every week for an hour, the 5 universities in Greater Manchester have met to talk together about the challenges we're facing, about where we can work together, where we can align, whether it's anything from research, education, how we get students home safely at Christmas, how we do mass testing, and many other factors. Just a very brief word about the University of Manchester, because I don't want to focus on it, but just to give you some context, we have about 40,000 students and about 12,000 staff, a high proportion of international students, about 13,000 are international students. We cover pretty much all disciplines, and including humanities, science, technology, medicine, and so on. And like most universities, we're run as an independent charity. So in general, universities have a governing council or a governing body. They oversee them. They're not that different to the board of a large company. And I've served on the board of a FTSE top 30 company for 9 years. Their role is oversight and governance. It is not management. That is normally done by a senior executive. Then within universities, other important bodies include what might be called in some universities a senate, but some academic representation where staff come together to debate, to advise, to consider, and in some cases to approve what is happening within the university. So you asked me to say a few words about the role of a Vice-Chancellor and a comparison to scientific leadership, and I suppose I have to some extent done both. There are a lot of similarities. For both, much of your day is solving problems, whether they're research problems or problems in my role as Vice-Chancellor, of staff, of students, of finance. In both, you have to look after and lead people, although obviously of a very different scale. To me, scientific leadership is very much leading by example. It's about demonstrating what you would do, how you are doing it. And I think it's extremely difficult to be a scientific leader without having some scientific credibility, whether that's as a leading scientist, or it might be in business as somebody who develops, for example, new products, new drugs, new knowledge, and so on. But I think that's extremely difficult without it. And throughout my career, I've trained over 50 PhD students and probably a similar number of research staff. One of the challenges of scientific leadership, as in many roles, is the desire that is always there to create others in your own image. And I've realized over many years that that's a mistake. I used to think that every PhD student who failed to go on to research and academic leadership was my failure. And now looking back on the over 50, Quite a number of them are professors, are leaders around the world, but a lot of them have hugely successful careers that are not in research. They can be in politics, it can be in writing, in teaching, in business administration, charitable sector, public engagement, media, and so on. And it's quite difficult not to assume that anybody that doesn't follow your path is doing well. The other thing that I learned early on, which I think is important but sometimes difficult, is you must always look for those that you are leading to be better than you were. In other words, you've got to impart all the knowledge you possibly can to them and then help them to be better than you were. Then, of course, leadership in a university. And before becoming Vice-Chancellor of the University of Manchester, I held the roles of Vice President for Research for a number of years, overseeing all of the research in the university, and then became Deputy Vice-Chancellor. I mentioned quite a number of similarities, but there are also some fundamental differences. Scale is an obvious one, and that's quite a difficult adaptation. With most research leaders, you know everybody in your research group. You talk to them on a very regular basis, albeit now by video, I'm afraid. But at least you know them, you know their issues, you know their challenges, you know how they're doing. And unfortunately, in my case, you keep in contact with many of them. And indeed, 7 of them have academic positions at the University of Manchester. When you become Vice-Chancellor and you have 12,000 staff and 40,000 students, that is much, much more difficult. And I think one of the biggest challenges of leading any large organisation is communication. That's particularly difficult in challenging times such as COVID. I met a group of students at the weekend, last weekend, and I asked them about how well we were communicating with them about all the things that are going on. And the answer was very well and very badly. The very well was you send us lots and lots of information. Very badly, it's not in a format that we want. We don't want to get emails. We want you to communicate with our WhatsApp groups and our Instagram, which was a fair comment. And of course, communication is about listening as well as about speaking and telling. I think one of the challenges of leading a university is the number and the diversity of stakeholders. The most obvious ones are our staff and our students, but there's our future potential students, our alumni, in my case, 500,000 known alumni. Then there are all the different funders, the government, charities, international bodies, and of course, industrial funding as well. Then there are the local stakeholders, the local councillors, the local leaders in government, and of course, national leaders. Universities are charities, but we are regulated by the Office for Students. We also have strong interactions with the Department for Education and the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Sometimes it's a bit of a challenge being led by 2 different government departments. And then, of course, there are many, many people who believe they have a stake in a university. Some, it might be questionable, but who frequently write to tell me what we should and should not be doing. But there's also, I think, a challenge for universities at the present time, in that sometimes we're thought of as not simply places of learning and discovery, but of places where we're expected to police certain things, we're expected to be, to some extent, health supporters in terms of mental health. We are independent bodies, but we also have strong issues around compliance, around reporting, and around legal aspects, all of which we need to take into account. The structures of universities vary enormously. Not most have faculties, schools, departments, whatever else. Sometimes they have many of them. We have rather few of them. But really, in a way, structures are nothing more than a means to an end. And one of the biggest challenges in universities is getting cross-structure, cross-disciplinary activities, whether that's in teaching or it's in research. You asked me to make a few comments about finance, and one of the things you have to do as a Vice-Chancellor is take on the role of something called the Chief Accountable Officer. In other words, if your university is in financial difficulties, it is you who is accountable. And each year when our auditors have reviewed our accounts, they have to sign off what they call a going concern. In other words, they feel you're viable in the future. I'm also the person who, if we have very, very serious legal issues, is the one who goes to prison. And I'm afraid delegating authority doesn't count. So the models for finances for universities can vary somewhat. Most British research-intensive universities get half or a little more of their income from student fees, whether that is fees for home students, which is fixed at a maximum of £9,250, or it's fees from international students. A large part of the rest is some government grant funding, whether it's for research or for teaching, although that's diminished dramatically over recent years. Another large part is our research grant and contract income. And then there are small parts that come in from donations, from student residencies, from conferences, from catering, from interest on our endowments. And of course, we've faced big challenges. As a rough rule of thumb for most research-intensive universities, for British students and up until next year, European students, we either roughly break even or we make a small loss on that fee income. And that varies depending on subjects. For international students, there is a margin of surplus. And on research, we lose money. It's estimated that the costs of research to universities in the UK through the mixture of government and charities meets just over 70% of full costs. For us, that gap is about £150 million a year. That means we have to cross-subsidise. And that has been a real issue as we face COVID. We've all lost significant income through residencies, catering, conferences, and so on. There was a very, very big concern about loss of income through international students, though that actually hasn't been manifest. And we've seen large numbers of international students still studying at our universities, albeit some of them are studying online. But we're all looking very, very carefully about value for money. Just a word about British students. Obviously, that's largely through a loan system. And I'm often asked who pays for British students. At the moment, it's about 50% the individual and about 50% the government. And that's reflecting the default on the loan system. We do have high fees in the UK, although nothing like as high as the private universities in other parts of the world. And one of the really important issues about education is student mobility and widening participation. And every university spends a lot of money on student bursaries, particularly for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. So threats, of course, there are many. Actually, in the current frenzied COVID situation, it's easy to forget that Brexit is looming. That does have significant implications for universities. There are two key ones, and that is research funding, whether through Horizon or through the European research funding, with the government saying that they will make up that funding, but obviously it will be somewhat different. Then we are likely to lose a large proportion of European students because they will no longer be under the UK fee system and eligible for loans. We have to treat them as international students because we can't discriminate between a German student and an Indian or a Chinese student. But I think of more concern to most universities is European collaboration and being part of European networks. Other threats, I think, at the present time, many industries, which we collaborate with very strongly, whether they're small or large, have had to pull their wings in somewhat because of financial implications of COVID. And that has in some cases meant that they've reduced or at least put on hold their research collaborations and their research funding. Another big threat, of course, which is always present, but I think is much more prominent at the present time, is mental health and well-being, and particularly so for young people. In the COVID crisis, young people have suffered more than many. The young and the very old are the ones that I think have taken the brunt of this. And as I think of our students entering university this time for the first time away from home, many of them have missed months of school, and fairly quickly after they joined university, they faced a national lockdown. A further threat that universities face is what's known as the looming pension crisis, what's known as the USS, the main pension scheme for universities, where the deficit has increased dramatically, estimated from a £4 billion deficit to anything up to an £18 billion deficit. For the University of Manchester, we currently spend £100 million a year on the USS, and that's likely to be significantly more. But of course, the biggest threat has been COVID. Universities changed everything they did in March. Most, like mine, didn't close completely, but we stopped all face-to-face teaching. We not only maintained, but we dramatically increased the amount of COVID research that we were undertaking. And contrary to many views, a lot of students didn't simply go home. We had 1,000 students or more still staying with us, often because they could not go home, because they were international students and we had to look after them. We opened again, obviously for the new term, with concerns about how that would work, with a mixture of learning, both online and face-to-face. During this period, we've also seen universities with very, very major activities in volunteering and contributing more widely to the local community. For every university, safety has to be the first consideration. And I've had many discussions about this and about how we balance safety against what is really important about not allowing young people to put their education on hold completely, about mental health issues of isolation, and indeed about engaging with our students. Research is running again now in all universities, albeit somewhat differently, distanced, but nevertheless, our researchers have been incredibly inventive and incredible at developing practical ways of continuing their research. I do believe strongly that universities can be contributors to the recovery from COVID. The government has pledged that it will increase research funding to 2.4% of GDP. That's an interesting question as GDP has fallen dramatically. But a figure of £22 billion has been repeatedly mentioned. Though of course we face very significant financial challenges in this country. You may have seen that there has been developed by government a new research and development roadmap, and I've been involved in that. There's also developments around people and culture, and I think a significant shift from competition to collaboration in research. Competition's a good thing. It keeps quality and standards up, but it can also be divisive. And I've often said that the UK is neither large enough nor rich enough to set all universities in competition with each other. And we know that our research funding systems are very inefficient. Many of you, if you're in universities, will have spent many, many weeks and months writing that grant application to realise there's a very low percentage chance of success. And I know that the funding bodies are looking at ways in which that can be improved. We're also moving towards a situation where there are more universities working together in consortia. I give you one example of that from my own university. The Royce Institute for Research into Advanced Materials partners with Liverpool, Leeds, Sheffield, Oxford, Cambridge, and Imperial. And there are many other such consortia where governments are working together. One aspect of this pandemic has been a very major financial impact on the medical charities, which is of concern because, of course, medical research is particularly important at the current time. We know that charities such as Cancer Research UK, British Heart Foundation, Alzheimer's Society, and many other charities are really struggling because their donations have gone down. For the government, the key issues in research that I've been in discussion with a great deal, partly in my role as co-chair of Council for Science and Technology, but also in my role as chair of the Russell Group, has been the sustainability of research funding, of getting that funding onto a footing where we don't have to cross-subsidise. The three other very big areas are net zero, the biggest challenge we probably face, which is a sustainable environment and mitigation of climate change. And you may have seen the government's 10-point plan that has just come out. Another area that is important to government is what's called levelling up. This isn't about taking money away from successful areas, which would, in my opinion, be a disaster, but it's about trying to improve the prosperity and productivity of all regions of the UK. The UK is probably the most unipolar economy in the developed world. And by that, I mean, it's the one where the ratio of the capital to any other city is the widest. Every other economy has other cities, other regions that are also prospering. And finally, the other area for research is recovery, COVID recovery. And that will be about science, whether it's about vaccines, about identifying who's the most susceptible to COVID, about very early markers, about identifying who will be the most susceptible, not just to catching COVID, but to the devastating impacts. We still don't really know why some people are infected and have almost no symptoms, and others have devastating symptoms. But also universities will be contributing to the recovery in understanding the issues of social change, of isolation, of mental health, of economic recovery, and of disadvantaged groups. And of course, COVID has widened some of those disadvantages. So let me summarize on universities and research. Universities have been around for 1,000 years, and let's hope they're going to be around for the next 1,000. My own university will soon be celebrating its 200th anniversary, so it's relatively young. But we are facing challenges that nobody has ever seen before, just like the rest of society. Sustainability will be incredibly important, but so will agility and adaptability. Staff in universities have been absolutely remarkable at adapting, not within months or weeks, but within days of moving online, of teaching online, of doing a lot of the research online, about holding the research group meetings like this in different ways. And we need to sustain that adaptability. I hope we will soon be able to go back to face-to-face meetings, teaching extensively, but we also need to hang on to the things that have gone very well. I think universities have an important role to play in society. We're anchor institutions in many regions. We're large employers. We also contribute significantly to the local economy. But we need to play our role in that wider engagement and that wider communication. We have a big economic impact, and we need to make sure that we continue to do that. We need to work more closely with businesses. There was one research and development leader of a large company said publicly, indeed to the Chancellor, universities need to get better at working with us in the commercial sector, but whatever you do, don't turn great universities into second-rate companies. So we do all need to remember our core mission and what we are about public benefit, about learning, about discovery, and about public inquiry. For individual universities, I think we need to think ever more about where are we distinctive, what is our core mission, and what is our value. But while things feel quite difficult at the moment for universities, as for the rest of society, I'm an optimist. I think we have a vaccine coming soon. I think that has resulted from amazing research, quite a lot of it in universities, and I'm very hopeful for the future, for universities, for science, for technology, and for you as future leaders. I hope you will learn from this conference. I'm very, very happy to take any of your questions, and I just wish you all the best for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dame Nancy. I think everyone would agree a huge amount of ground covered there, and you've obviously stimulated plenty of questions, and good to see people asking questions and other people upvoting them as well. So we'll come on to the questions after we've had the panel session, which we'll now move on to. So we've got 4 people joining Dame Nancy on the panel, and we'll start the panel session with asking each of them to give some initial views. And to start off, can I ask Professor David Umber to give us his perspective? Professor Umber is Pro-Vice Chancellor of Research and Enterprise at De Montfort University. David, over to you.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I must say, Professor Dame Nancy Rockwell's keynote speech was excellent. I think a real comprehensive review of the university sector. And I share that optimism for a vaccine. I really do hope we can have one fairly soon. I'm going to perhaps present a different view for the audience. Dame Nancy spoke a lot about the Russell Group and mentioned that in terms of tuition fee income, the Russell Group was typically about 50 or just over 50%. Well, I come from a different type of university, a kind of post-92 university, which is more teaching intensive but research active. And in this type of environment, we have perhaps 85 or a bit more of our income from tuition fees, and perhaps 5 or 7% on research. So it's a very different type of university. But however, we all have the same types of missions, same types of objectives for the public good and for working to support our local communities. My university, De Montfort University, is sited right in the city centre in Leicester, and have a large widening participation agenda, and work very, very closely with the local community. You know, as the first city that went into local lockdown, you know, colleagues in the life sciences were, you know, within a couple of days, we're out and about working with the city centre, with the city council, sorry, to address some of the lockdown issues and providing some advice. Similarly, the type of research we do, applied type of research, we had investigations into the survivability of the virus on nursing gowns. So again, this is an example of applied type of research that we carried out to support the city council and the city during the COVID lockdown. I've been in my role for about 8 months, and one of the very first things as I suppose a research leader in the university, and so perhaps something that you might eventually have to face at some point in time, is for universities like mine, the post-92s, time allocation for research. It's something that is a challenge, and it's a challenge for 2 reasons. Whereas for example, with the Russell Group universities, a large proportion of research time is bought out. It's bought out because of council grants. You know, 77% of council grants in the UK goes to Russell Group. 4% comes to the post-92s. And there are about 33 universities in the post-92s, all scrambling for a little bit of that 4%. So with types of universities, the post-92 types of universities, there's always a balance between the requirements to do some teaching and the drag on teaching time, whilst at the same time trying to evidence the value of the research that we do. So impact is very much on our agenda. So for research leaders who are perhaps going to be going into a post-92 type institution, is to be mindful of that tension between having to provide the resource for teaching, but yet, because we haven't got research time bought out, having to put the case forward for the value of that time to build on research capacity, to inform teaching, and to have the impact locally to make that research valuable. So not just do we have to, as a university, evidence value for money externally, but even internally, because of these types of tensions, have to evidence value for research, value for time for research within an internal institution. So those are some of the challenges that different types of universities can have, while still ultimately trying to address the agenda of growing research, addressing societal challenges, and demonstrating and evidencing the impact for the work that we're doing. So I just thought I would share a different perspective on what research can look like in a I suppose, a typical post-92 university. Ultimately, it's about providing support for the public. Okay, so Rebecca, that was all I was just going to say for about 5 minutes, I think.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for giving us that different perspective from a different type of university. We're now going to move on to our next panellist, which is Professor Tim Bedford. Professor Bedford is Associate Principal of Research and Knowledge Exchange at the University of Strathclyde and also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Tim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. So I'm very pleased to be here and able to talk. It's great to be able to follow on from Nancy and David's contributions here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my university. That's the University of Strathclyde. We're based in Glasgow. We're the 3rd largest university in Scotland. I'll tell you first of all a little bit myself, because I think that story is interesting on how I got there. And you'll see that we're quite a complementary university to Manchester and to De Montfort. So for myself, I'm originally a pure mathematician. I was brought up, if you like, I did my PhD at Warwick. I was a postdoc at Cambridge. But then, being a pure mathematician, I was looking for a little bit more. And I was attracted to Delft University of Technology, which I moved to, and that's where I had my first real academic job. And at Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands, they have a tradition of working closely with industry. And actually, I immediately started industrial collaboration with Philips and then the European Space Agency. And I really knew that I'd found my comfort zone. And what happened to me through going to have an experience abroad was it wasn't just about transforming me as a person. It was also transferring the way I thought about my work and the kind of research I wanted to do. So after 13 years in Delft, I was contacted by some research colleagues at the University of Strathclyde, actually in the business school. So I switched over from mathematics into business, and I was attracted by the colleagues, but also by the mission of the university. It's called a place of useful learning, and that had a similar commitment to industrial collaboration as Delft. So in some sense, what I'm going to talk here about is a little bit about the authenticity of the mission of a university and how research leadership is supported by that authenticity. So to come to our university then, we are the only university in Scotland that was founded during the Enlightenment period, founded in 1796. So we just managed to beat Manchester there, Nancy. We were founded by a man called John Anderson, who was a friend of James Watt. James Watt had an office or a workshop very, very close to us. Anderson was also a friend of Benjamin Franklin. This university was established then at the start of the Industrial Revolution. It was committed to adult education for workers and for women right from the very start. George Birkbeck was actually the second professor. So there's all sorts of interesting connections there with a lot of the movements which established universities throughout the 19th century. Later on, it became the Royal College of Science and Technology, and through the Victorian era, it delivered most of Scotland's engineers, and then it became the University of Strathclyde in 1964. Now, that phrase, a place of useful learning, is very much an Enlightenment expression, and in fact, as Rebecca knows, the Royal Society of Edinburgh has got a very similar strapline, if I can call it that, knowledge made useful. But useful learning is capable of multiple interpretations. And much more recently, we've followed the line that Nancy actually mentioned there in the distinctiveness of our core mission. And under the leadership, in the last 10 years, under the leadership of Sir Jim MacDonald, our Vice Chancellor, we've developed what I think is a very distinctive strategy. We're research intensive, we're socially progressive, and we consider ourselves to be a leading international technological university. And technological universities, of course, existed. Manchester, of course, had one, University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology. Imperial College is an absolute global star as a technological institution. In other parts of Europe, actually, the notion of a technological university is much, much more common than it is nowadays in the UK. So that's a real important point of how we characterize ourselves as a university. Now, as I said, in the last 10 years, we've been pushing very hard down that route. And I would say that one of the interesting things about us is that we feel very comfortable as an institution in covering a wide range of technology readiness levels, probably broader than most universities would feel comfortable with. And we are highly collaborative, working intensively with industrial and public sector partners. We're also socially progressive. I said that, and I noted the point that David made. We are also very, very strongly committed to widening access. And actually, we have the largest number of students from the Scottish target group for widening access, that's SIMD 0 to 40, of any of the research intensive universities in Scotland. Now, as a university, we're firmly grounded in the heart of Glasgow. And I've mentioned that ability to to build collaborations and win funding to develop organizational physical infrastructures that support impactful research. This was actually recognized in the Bayes R&D roadmap, which was published recently. And they included the Strathclyde innovation ecosystem as a case study. Now, that isn't just Strathclyde, it's about many of our research centers, but it's also about our broader innovation partners. It's about the way we try to attract and host independent research organizations on our campus. For example, we have not only our own centres, but we've got 4 Scottish Funding Council centres. We've got 4 catapult organisations on campus and the National Physical Laboratory as well. And in addition to that, the Fraunhofer Gesellschaft, we have the only Fraunhofer branch on campus. Now, There's a really relentless focus here on quality and collaboration. And that quality means a focus on recruiting excellent people. We have obviously excellent researchers here and professional services staff, but we also have a unique category of staff which we introduced, the knowledge exchange pathway. This is a special pathway which enables you to have a whole career specializing in knowledge exchange. And that gives us an ability to attract people who are most comfortable intellectually in working across the boundary of industry and university research. I think that's something that's particularly special about us. And in fact, our major centers have got several hundred staff who are on this unique pathway. The reason we introduced it was because we noticed that when people wanted to collaborate with industry and make that their specialism, actually there was no way for them to have promotion within our systems. So recognition and reward for the kinds of behaviors you want to have as a university are absolutely key to success. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we can pick up some of these points in the discussion later on.
Thank you very much, Tim. I should can't help myself mentioning that Strathclyde may have just be slightly older than Manchester, but slightly younger than the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1783. So I'll just that plug there. That was great. We're now moving on to our two final panelists. And as part of that, we're very keen to have some input from the 2020 cohort of Foundation Future Leaders. So we've got two of those participants who are going to speak as the next two panelists, and they're going to give a brief perspective and say a little bit about the Future Leaders programme itself. So I'm going to turn first to Professor Helen Dodd from the University of Reading. Helen.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to be part of the panel today. I've been fortunate enough to be one of the Foundation for Science and Technology Future Leaders over the past year, which has been a fantastic experience. So I'd like to tell you just briefly a little bit about who I am and my background, and a little bit about why I wanted to join that programme this year. So I've had a relatively typical academic career. I did my PhD and postdoc in Sydney in Australia, and then I came back here as a lecturer, and I've been promoted to professor last year. This means that some of my time has been spent delivering lectures, supervising undergraduate students, supervising postgraduate students, and also, of course, doing research. At the moment, I'm very fortunate to be funded by a UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship, which gives me dedicated time to work on a programme of research. So that covers most of my salary, which means that at the moment, I'm not teaching and I'm mostly focusing on research. So I often reflect that when I was first offered the opportunity to do a PhD, I turned it down, and I said that I didn't want to be an academic because I wanted to do something that was real. I didn't want to sit in an office and think about things. I wanted to do something that made a difference to the world. And after working in a research centre in Sydney in Australia for a while, I realised that actually academics can play a vital role in generating that new knowledge that can inform policy and inform business. And that's something that then made me go back and say, actually, I think I would like to do a PhD because I think I can make a difference in this way. And it's something that I've been striving to do in my work. But it's not easy, and it's not something that I've totally got sussed. And there's a lot more that I would like to be doing in terms of making sure that the research I do has some impact and has some meaning in the real world, I guess. It's not just about publishing academic papers. So one of the reasons that I wanted to take part in the Foundation for Science and Technology programme was to start to build those better relationships and having a better understanding with government and with business. And I imagine that lots of you who've joined the webinar today maybe have done so for the same reason, that you might be working in academia, doing a PhD early in your career and thinking, how do we achieve this magical impact? But what I've realized is that there isn't a magic bullet here. There is no, one thing which is going to solve this problem. There isn't some secret society that you don't know about, and once you know about it, then you'll be able to have impact. It's really about building relationships over time, getting a better understanding about how all these different systems work. And events like this, I think, are really helpful for that. I'd just like to finish up by saying that I also think it's important that we recognise that not all research naturally lends itself to impact, to implications for policy or to business applications. And I think it's important that we don't forget that that work that basic science can also be really, really valuable. And we never know in 100 years' time when something might become really important. So whilst I think personally that it's really important that I do research that has impact, I think we need to balance that also with supporting the basic science and basic research as well. So I'll hand back now to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. And we're now coming on to our last panelist and second Foundation Future Leader, who is Dr. Benjamin Litchman from the University of York. Benjamin.
Great. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for the introduction. Hello, I'm Benjamin Litchman from the Centre for Novel Agricultural Products at the University of York. I'm a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow and a member of the FST Foundation Future Leaders Cohort. I'm very grateful for Gavin and the FST for inviting me to speak as part of the panel. We've already heard some really interesting insights on the challenges at universities from Nancy, David, Tim and Helen. Just a short plug for the FST Foundation Leaders Programme. It's been an amazing experience. I've learned a huge amount about the interactions between government, industry and academia. I think it's going to be completely invaluable for my career in the future. So my research group investigates how plants make chemicals, how these compounds are originate molecularly and through evolution. And I also think about how we can exploit these processes to develop new medicines and agrochemicals. And so my research spans the boundary between basic science and translational research. And I'm kind of navigating this area at the moment, looking for commercial applications, industrial partners, but also thinking about the strong basic science. And so it's been interesting to hear Tim's insight into how Strathclyde balances the more fundamental science with industry collaboration. At this point, I'd also like to mention my own two concerns about the sustainability of research funding, as kind of brought up by Nancy. So one thing is UKRI has a new CEO, and it'd be interesting to see how UKRI is able to balance long-term basic science research funding, as well as the more impact-driven strategic and translational work. The balance between these is really important, and it'll be interesting to see how that develops. And a final point is mentioning from David's and Nancy's point about the tensions within academia and the academic workload, the idea that research funding is has to be cross-subsidized by funding from other sources. And I'm concerned that this raises student numbers, which is potentially fine, but of course it puts then increasing pressures on academics to balance teaching and research. And I think from my peers at university, it's clear that younger academics may find it challenging to establish an effective research program whilst also having these increasing pressures of teaching. So I'm wondering what the future looks like in that area, and it'll be great to discuss that during this panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, and thank you to Dame Nancy and to all our panelists, and thanks to everyone for keeping to time as well. We've got a lot of questions that are coming up through the Q&A, so it's great to have almost 40 minutes to be able to come on to those. So can I ask all the panelists please to now put their cameras back on, and we'll have a proper panel session. There's lots of questions already on the Q&A, but please do feel free to continue asking questions, or indeed to vote for those ones that you're most keen to hear from. I'm just waiting for Dame Nancy to have her camera.
You're controlling my video. The host has stopped it, so I can't open it.
Gavin, can you deal with that?
Just working on that, but
Yep, done. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think that's us all now. So as I say, plenty of questions coming through, and actually I think we'll start with actually where Benjamin was just finishing, which was about the model for research funding. I think probably a number of people who are in the audience were probably quite taken, Dame Nancy, what you said about funding of research, and actually universities only get about 70% of the full economic costs for that. So the question is about how or where can the funding model change for research, particularly given that research excellence is so important for a university's reputation and for innovation in the UK?
So one of the questions was, do you think it's reasonable to expect we can get full economic costing? Actually, no, I don't. And I've been with a group arguing with funders that it should be better than it is now. I don't have a problem with some level of cross-subsidy, whether that is from philanthropy or from other contract research and so on. But 30% subsidy is just too much. But what I didn't mention was the cross-subsidy in terms of people. And I think Benjamin alluded to this somewhat. I mean, we are asked to assess how we all spend our time under something called track, and we have to return this. And this is based on the assumption of a fixed hours working week. I know very few academics that do a 37-hour week, and whether they're teachers or researchers, and that isn't counted. And that's a huge cross subsidy in terms of human capital. And certainly most successful researchers spend many, many hours beyond that. But in terms of the model, we are discussing with government about putting more into the real costs of research. Now, under the current climate, I'm not sure I'm too optimistic about that. And there are only two ways of doing that. One is to put more money in, and the other is if you've got a fixed pot of money, then there's a lower volume of research, but it's better funded. And I suspect it'll be somewhere between the two, I hope.
Thank you, Dame Nancy. David, what would a good research funding model look like for a university like De Montfort?
Tricky question. I suppose, I mean, for us, for our type of university, I think access to more funding would be helpful, because very much at this point in time, we're very much subsidizing, and the cross subsidy is coming from teaching. Whilst we do want to maintain the research activity, and because we know what all the values are from that, where we do struggle is with capital research equipment and the capital to be able to purchase some of those more expensive equipment that would fundamentally help growing new research areas. And that's really, again, down to government funding and having more access to some of the council funding. The knowledge exchange pathway, which Tim mentioned, is another interesting model. We've just began, in fact, I will speak with Tim later on, just began to establish something very similar. And the idea is to see how we can bring industry into research via this pathway. So that may be one other way of trying to entice industry into a more sustained research program agenda, as opposed to paying for research contracts over 3 or 4 years. So that's another way that we're trying to address some of those issues. But ultimately, if we can get full economic costing, I think that would be a huge benefit. But for us, we are using some of our teaching to subsidize.
Thank you, David. Tim, is there anything you want to add? I mean, obviously Strathclyde gets a huge amount of money from working with companies and business. In terms of the funding model for a university like Strathclyde, what does it look like for you?
Well, I would say that you shouldn't expect to see industry as a magic money tree. They are operating also on the basis of trying to get the best that they can at a reasonable price. I would say that often the 80% funding FEC model is something that industry knows about, because they often participate in the UKRI projects, and that's a good thing. On the other hand, that means that often that's in their heads as the baseline for directly funded engagement. Obviously, what we try to do is to diversify our income as much as we can. So looking at other things, we have a great conference centre, which unfortunately at the moment is not generating any income whatsoever. But you've got to do, as a university, you've got to try and broaden that out. Can I maybe also make a point from an institution in a devolved nation, which is that Scottish universities, of course, get part of their funding in the dual support system from the Scottish government through the Scottish Funding Council. So in other words, all the money that you get from the REF, participating in the REF, that goes through the Barnett formula to Scottish government, and it gets distributed in that way. And Scottish government has got the right under the devolution formula, obviously, to use that as it will. What that means is that actually in Scotland we have slightly less relative, I think, to the English universities in terms of the overall funding that comes in through that part of the dual funding system. And from our point of view, actually ensuring that there's a balanced playing field across the UK is an extremely important issue for Scottish universities, which I think is an important point to note here.
Thanks very much, Tim. I'm going to move on to another question. I think this was aimed at Dame Nancy, but just a heads up that I'm going to come to Helen and Benjamin for their reflections on this as well. Dame Nancy, there's a question about, you know, you've obviously got a massive role leading the university, and the question is about how you personally reconcile and handle and I guess balance those immediate short-term challenges, which obviously are very much to the fore at the moment with COVID. But how do you balance that with an eye to the longer-term issues and problems that clearly you need to be thinking about as head of the university?
With difficulty. No, that's a flippant answer. So you do have the here and now, and no day is as it was planned. It always gets unravelled. But I also try and create time and space to have discussions about long-term future. We had spent a couple of hours this week looking at the post-COVID. I think another issue which I didn't address in terms of leadership is delegation and partnership. And it's actually quite hard to do. It was one of the things I found most difficult in a transition from first doing all the research myself to then just supervising others, with the arrogant and completely misguided view that if only I was doing it, it would be much quicker, which was patently untrue. But, you know, wanting to interfere in everything, and then moving up to leadership positions that are much bigger, and realizing you have to let others make decisions. You have to empower them. Even if they're not always doing things the way you would have done them, they might be doing it better. So I think an awful lot of it is about saying, what do I have to do? Where do I have to take that on myself? And where are there others that not only could do it, but often could do it better than you can do it? And that's a really important thing to grasp as you're becoming a leader.
Thank you very much, Dame Nancy. Benjamin and Helen, I mean, we hear a lot about the sort of the pressures on sort of younger academics, and I can describe you in that way, and all the different things you're juggling. So any reflections from the two of you, maybe starting with Benjamin first, in terms of actually how you handle some of those immediate things, but also think about longer term issues, including your longer term career. Benjamin, do you want to kick off?
Yes, I'll admit that the transition from a postdoc to a group leader has been quite bewildering at some points. And so as a postdoc, you know, thinking week to week in terms of what experiments you're doing and getting papers together is one thing. And then you're kind of thrown into managing a team, thinking about finances, grant applications, administration, teaching. And suddenly there's just so much more to be dealing with. And it takes time to get used to it. I think I'm kind of getting a handle on it at the moment. And luckily I have this fellowship that gives me some longer term support, so I don't have to always be thinking about the, you know, applying for grants and that sort of thing. But certainly in the future, that will be, I can imagine that being a large part of my work. I would kind of like maybe the UKRI or other organizations to provide some more support for people entering into group leader positions. I think that would be quite useful, maybe within universities as well. I think that transition can be quite difficult.
Thank you, Benjamin. Helen.
I totally agree with what's already been said. I think in terms of things to add to that, one of the things that I try to do is make sure that I have scheduled time with my team and myself, also with the people who mentor me, to sit and reflect in terms of where are we going. What is it that we want to achieve? Are we on track for, you know, we met 3 months ago, we said we wanted to do these things. How are we getting on in terms of progressing on those plans, which helps us, I think, to start to recognize how far we've come and to make sure that those longer term plans are being put into place and aren't being forgotten amongst the kind of day-to-day noise and things that come up there. And I find that process hugely helpful.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'll move on to a third question, and there's a couple of related questions to it as well. And the question is about that, you know, the last couple of days of this conference have been looking about how government and industry should embed and encourage science. And the question is around actually the responsibility that universities have in terms of developing their scientists and students to understand how their area of expertise fits within these different sectors, and the importance of that in terms of supporting communication across government and industry. I should declare a personal interest here. I left the university sector in the early 2000s. I had a research fellowship, another 3-year research fellowship to go to, but I wanted to do a bit like Helen. I wanted to do something a bit more applied, but it was very much seen as an anathema at the time. You know, why would you leave academia and go into government? And then since then I've gone into a charity, but why would you do that if you were succeeding in academia? So it's quite interesting to hear that maybe that's still a bit of the underlying narrative. But Tim, could I maybe come to you first of all, sort of to address that question? How do you actually ensure that scientists and students have an understanding of where their expertise fits, and I guess the different ways that it can be applied, including but also out with academia.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and of course there isn't a single answer to this. I guess we try to do multiple things at Strathclyde. So we have a number of industrial centres which have been established, which have got industry partners, and we very often bring those industrial partners together with groups of academics. We within the academic sections of our of our staff, we've also developed a number of strategic themes which you can find on our website, and these are really cross-faculty themes. So they're thematics such as health, energy, manufacturing, energy, society and policy. We've got one on measurement science and enabling technologies. People come together across those things because they've got common interests, but that also enables us to bring together quite easily the groups of people who've got interests which are of interest to particular external stakeholders. And that makes it relatively easy for us to bring together people and create that first experience of our academics in engaging with industry and industrial problems. So I think we've done that. We've also tried fellowships or sort of exchanges with industry. I think this is a bit more difficult because people find it maybe a little bit difficult to leave an academic career. Of course, you're on a train that's driving at very high speed if you're an academic. I must say, again, one of the benefits I had from going to the Netherlands at an early stage of my career was that I wasn't subject to the ref. I think that enabled me really to switch domains a couple of times while I was an academic, and I've certainly benefited from that. I think our UKRI does fund some switching of areas for the academics. I think that's a very, very valuable thing to make you a multifaceted academic, and then also much more able to understand industrial challenges from multiple perspectives. Because to be quite honest, when industry come with a problem, they've often not stated it in a way which is really amenable to research or a way which really captures all the different challenges. So multidisciplinary academic thinking, I think, is also a key element that I would say in ensuring that we can have successful collaboration with industry.
Thanks so much, Tim. Dame Nancy, what would be your ideas and suggestions for how we improve communication and the sharing of ideas and people, indeed, between government and industry and academia?
So there are a lot of opportunities for young researchers, for PhD students to spend some time either in Parliament as researchers in Parliament or in local government or in industry. I was fortunate, I had what was at the time called a Case Award, where I spent half my PhD in industry, and then I've had strong industrial interactions. And there was a really interesting question actually about how do you balance working with industry with your academic freedom. I've never had a problem with that. I've chosen what industrial interactions I've had, and I found industry to be posing just as exciting a questions as we were. On occasions, I've done what you might call contract research for industry, where they've said, will you do this experiment? I don't want to do it. So I tell them how much it will cost and I multiply by 5, and they say, fine. So, it's a straight contract, but most of my interactions with industry have been incredibly intellectually stimulating. But we should think of this not just in terms of future career, but skills, even if you want to stay as a researcher. One of the things I am absolutely passionate about is public engagement and wider communication. And I always quote one of my great heroes of the past, Sir Peter Medawar, a Nobel Prize winner. And if I can advise anybody to read a book, it would be read Advice to a Young Scientist. It was published 50 years ago and it still applies today, and it's only a short book. And he said, one way to judge your communication skills is to talk to 9-year-olds. And actually, if you can talk to 9-year-olds, you can talk to anybody. And it's a skill that is really, really difficult to get, but it helps in everything, whether it's scientific writing or public writing, talking at conferences, talking to the public. And I think we should be spending a lot more time in supporting young researchers and young leaders in communication skills.
Thanks so much, Dame Nancy. Helen, you were reflecting in your contribution at the start about actually you didn't necessarily see yourself as being an academic or staying in academia. Where do you see yourself now, and do you feel that you have got those opportunities for movement between the sectors?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think having the UKRI Future Leaders Fellowship has helped hugely with that. I don't know if Benjamin agrees there, but it has given me an opportunity to somewhat shift the focus of my research and to move into a more applied area of research. And that fellowship has 7 partners on it who are non-academic partners, which allows me to be building those relationships. I spend a lot of time with those organisations, observing what it is they do and learning from them. I think without the fellowship, that would still be a very difficult thing to do because of the time that it requires to build those relationships, to spend time with them, to engage with them. And I think if I had a normal teaching and administrative load of a professor, it would be very difficult for me to invest that time. So I'm really pleased to see funding schemes coming out which are supporting those transitions. I still think there's quite a lot of work to do in terms of that sort of attitude, as you say, that feeling like if I leave academia, then that's a failure somehow. And the same with, the people who I'm mentoring now. I want them to go on to have careers that fulfill them, and whether they are inside or outside of academia is irrelevant. But I'm not necessarily in a good position to mentor them to have careers outside of academia. As a PhD student, they're often surrounded only by people who've chosen academic careers. So I think we need to do what we can to increase that diversity of voices that they're hearing and experiences in terms of the people that our students are meeting and interacting with, so that they're more aware of what are these different options to me, and why would my skill set be useful for business or for the Parliamentary Office in Science Technology, for example. So I think there's still quite a lot of work to be done there, but certainly the funding schemes help support it from me personally.
Thank you, Helen. David.
Yes, thanks, Rebecca. It's just to follow on Tim's comment about the multidisciplinary type work and how that can help scientists find a fit. Again, in a not post-COVID, but still in COVID, aren't we? As part of the local recovery plan in Leicester, we've been working with about 60 community centres, the City Council, about 3 or 4 dozen businesses, and about 70 or 80 academic researchers in looking at a Build Back Better type program. And this has really helped scientists within our university to be able to see exactly where they can have the impact and where that skill set can align with policy, local government policy, to then have impact within society. So it absolutely has to be multidisciplinary, but it's about bringing the right people to the table to have that discussion. And then the path for impact the path for impact becomes quite clear then.
Thanks very much, David. And I should maybe give a plug to the Future Leaders scheme as well. So one of the nice things about that scheme about the programme is it does bring together people absolutely from academia, but also from the civil service and from business as well. And the Royal Society of Edinburgh is actually, we're also quite unusual as a national academy, because right from the beginning, we brought together people from the breadth of academia, but also people from business and public service as well. I think those intersections are both really interesting, but actually it's where you get the real challenges being addressed. There's a questions, I think, again, going on about actually the nature of academia and what's done in academia around actually how we encourage commercialization, but also a linked question I think that Nancy's already just touched on briefly is, but with that in commercialization and perhaps attached to that with an increased funding potentially coming from industry, what does that mean for academic freedom? Tim, do you want to pick that up first of all?
Yeah, that's interesting questions. I mean, I think I agree absolutely with Nancy when she said, as an academic, one of the great things about being an academic is you get to choose what you do, right? There are senior officers of a university will never try to tell you what research you should be doing. That's the independence, the wonderful independence of being an academic. But because of that, that means you can decide whether you will be doing research that's publicly funded or whether you want to go into more industrial kind of research. And of course, those things don't need to be exclusive. So I don't think there's any issue there with academic freedom. I think it's got to do more with what motivates you as a researcher in order to follow certain kinds of research projects. In terms of the fact that people you know, the different levels of support, and that not all academics want to be involved in industry. That's perfectly fair. You know, at my university, we see there's a whole range of different balances that people strike. So it depends very much on the opportunities and on the balance of interests. We've got people who are really more or less 100% involved with industrially funded research, and other people who have really got a very clear fundamental core of fundamental publicly funded research, but they're really interested in developing impact. And for that reason, they engage with industry in order to generate that impact. We also actually have a lot of people who've got this intermediary position in between university and industry. I mentioned already the knowledge exchange pathway. A lot of the people on that do this, and they support academics in their engagement with industry. And to be honest, I'm also personally supported by people who are working on that pathway. It helps me continue to engage in some of those industrial problems that there are. And so for me as a senior academic, it's also good for me and for my career that I'm able to stay in touch with those kinds of problems while I'm doing what is otherwise a reasonably busy role at the university.
Hey, Nancy or David, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked a lot about industry, but there are very different types of industry. There's the big companies, but also there's the small ones, and there are many academics who actually choose to set up their own company and spin it out. And you'll find every university now has support for doing this. It's not what everybody wants to do. Sometimes the people who discover new things are the worst ones to be leading a new company, but certainly quite a number of my staff have actually left academia to lead their company. And that's a really interesting path, but also working with a 3-man biotech company, as I've done, versus AstraZeneca that I was on the board of, brings different opportunities and challenges and can be really, really exciting. But then the other groups that we collaborate with, of course, as well, are not just industry, but for example, the National Health Service, the school services, financial services, government departments. I think the key for each of those, if you're going to do well, is to ask the question, what do they want out of this? What is their goal in this? And very often there is an alignment, but there might be something different. It's a bit the same as communication, where I always say, don't think about what you want to say, think about what your audience would like to hear or wants to understand. So trying to understand, what is it, if you're working with a government department, they need? What is it that company needs from you? And you might decide it's not something I want to give, or it might be something that's really exciting. You think, gosh, that's a route I want to take. But either way, broadening your experience is always a good thing to do.
Thanks, Nancy. David.
Yes, just carrying on from that, from Nancy, it's about the ecosystem, because there's quite a lot of academic colleagues who have some great ideas or that they want to patent, but don't know the steps to take to commercialize. And that's it's a really different agenda for them. And that's where the innovation centers can come in to provide the support to help realize what's commercially commercially viable from the intellectual property, to then take it on to the next steps. And just one last thing, again, with my experience, sometimes when you do have contract research with commercial companies, you're kind of limited to how much intellectual property you can own and how much you can exploit thereafter. But where it's just been an academic who's, found something new and wants to try and see how they can commercialize it, that ecosystem of getting the innovation centers from the university involved to support is one way of helping.
Thank you very much, David. For those of you who are in Scotland, if you've not already heard of it, there's an initiative called Interface, which is funded by the Scottish Funding Council, and that tries to bring together businesses with a particular research question with the research base as well. And picking up Dame Nancy's point, there are some big companies within that, but a lot of them are small and medium-sized enterprise, SMEs. So there's initiatives like that. I'm sure there's similar ones in England and across the UK. I think really help with that building of relationships between academia and industry. We have got a popular question which is about Brexit. As Dame Nancy said, it's maybe had less attention recently with all that's going on with COVID, but the question is about actually what the response to Brexit looks like, particularly a response that enables us to keep funding, but as importantly also to keep good partnerships. And maybe if I could just first turn to to Benjamin and Helen for any reflections on how you feel Brexit is impacting, or what difference it's making to you and your teams in your work at present. Benjamin.
So I think that I specifically, I don't collaborate with people in Europe. However, I'm aware that the collaboration within Europe could be more challenging. I think the government have been trying to stay part of the Horizon program. I'm not sure how successful that's been at the moment, but certainly without that funding, it's not really just about the money that's not going to be, that's not coming from Horizon, but it's about those interactions with Europe, certainly. I think that the UKRI are doing some good work in replacing some of those schemes. So I think that the Future Leader Fellowship that I and Helen have seems to be sort of like for like with the ERC starting grant. So there's some funding that's going into from the UK that replaces some of the European funding. I would say as well that the Global Talent Visa has been quite useful for me. So although there's been a lack of free movement may be impacted by Brexit, there's for postdocs and other scientists, there is the ability to move into the UK if you have the qualifications to do so.
Thanks, Benjamin. Helen?
I think the concern for me and the way that it's impacted me personally so far is about the people and about the message that Brexit might be sending to people internationally. So I've had members of my team decide that they want to go and live in Europe because they don't want to live in a country which doesn't want to be part of Europe. And for example, people who are married to somebody who's European, who themselves doesn't feel welcome here anymore. And so they've decided to go to Europe where their future is clearer, where they're not sure, are they going to be able to continue to live here? Are they going to have to apply for a visa every year? What's that going to look like? So I think, although, Benjamin's right that the visas are there, I think that there's a kind of almost a sort of perception now of the UK, which concerns me, that we may not be as open and as welcoming to people internationally, Europeans and beyond that, I think. So yeah, the concern really for me is what it might do, what it is doing to our international reputation in terms of feeling like a country that's open and welcoming to talent from all over the world.
Thank you very much, Helen. And Dame Nancy, obviously the University of Manchester and the Russell Group universities in particular get a huge amount of money as part of being a part of EU research programmes and have many partnerships. What's your sort of thoughts on response to Brexit that enables us to maintain funding and partnerships?
So, by the way, I should have said earlier, nobody calls me Dame Nancy, everybody just calls me Nancy. So I should have said that at the beginning, apologies. Yeah, interestingly, I'm chairing a meeting tomorrow with what's called U15, the leading 15 universities in Germany, and then we've just got an approach from France. I think Helen's sentiments are felt by many of us. The money is important, but actually more important, I think, is a concern that there might be a perception that the UK is not open, that is not welcoming, and certainly the day that the vote was announced, I called a meeting for any staff who wanted to come. It was at the time a face-to-face meeting, and a few hours notice there were 400 in the room. And 3 days later, we hosted what's called ESOF, European Science Open Forum, which was challenging. And I ended my talk by saying, many of us here would not be choosing this, but while we might not be part of the EU, we're still absolutely part of Europe. And I think, the funding is important. Whether we'll stay with Horizon, I don't know. There is a very big worry that the price tag put on Horizon by the EU might be just so high that could we spend the money better in other ways? But I do think the government is committed to making up that funding. I'm more worried about people interactions than I am about the money.
And I can see some nods from other panelists as well. David, Tim, anything you wanted to add on Brexit and the response to it? Tim?
If maybe I could say a couple of things. So for a start, I agree absolutely that the people element to this is the most important thing. If you look at flows of international talent, then you will see that actually the UK exports a lot of our talent. So people born in the UK often leave, and people come into the UK as researchers from other countries. The worst possible thing that could happen to the UK is that the exit continues while the input stops, and that would starve of us of future talent. Now, I do think that government is alive to this, and I know that there's been some very interesting work done. I'd commend you to have a look at the work that was done by Universities UK on future international partnerships, and I've put the link onto the chat. I was part of the group that helped to formulate those proposals, and these are proposals that would like to see really, of course, alongside collaboration with Europe. But I would say that what makes Europe so interesting is not just the fact that it's close and we've got lots of personal relations. And I should say, by the way, that I have a Dutch wife and 2 Dutch children from my time there, and she works actually in a university in the Netherlands. So we have our own personal issues around Brexit. But what's really key is that we have the mechanisms to be able to collaborate. What's great about the European model is that it is a multinational program. It enables the best researchers to come together from multiple countries to work together. That is what makes it attractive. And so you'll see in the Future International Partnerships document that there is a proposal that actually the UK should see that as a model for the future when it's looking to build further collaborations globally. So let's not be downbeat about the relationships with Europe. It'll be what it'll be. It'll emerge from those negotiations. We're keeping our fingers crossed clearly that we should participate in it, but there's lots of good ideas about how the UK can maintain its position as a as a leading global research nation and make it a fantastic place for people to do research. I'm convinced we'll manage to do that.
Thanks, Tim. David, was there anything you wanted to add?
Not much more I could add to that, other than from the human point of view, we have at my university lost some excellent staff who just decided to move on. So there's not much more I can add to that, but it has been difficult.
Thanks, David. I mean, a lot of the conversation there was also about the importance of collaboration, and Nancy's already talked about the collaboration that's sort of been prompted and maybe reinforced by COVID. There's also a question here about actually that balance between competition and collaboration, and a question about whether the UK is too small to have universities competing against each other, and if there might be any moves from government to bring universities a bit more together under one umbrella, as the question says, thinking about the way that the Australian government does things. Nancy, what would be your reflections on that?
I think that is happening. Interestingly, one of the best of the funding bodies at this is the ESRC, Economic and Social Sciences Research Council, that very often call for consortia. When there's a big problem to be solved, they say, come together. Interesting, Tim may be aware of this, that University of Manchester is working with the University of Strathclyde and Sheffield. We've come together as sort of partners in developing around advanced manufacturing, about industrial applications. Then, of course, there are various groupings around the country. We're part of something called the N8, which is the Northern 8 research intensive universities. So I think there are various different ways of doing it. It can be the universities themselves saying we want to partner together. We're actually working with Manchester Metropolitan University, which is right next door to us, on Creative Digital. Sometimes it's local, sometimes it's national, but I think government funding is moving more in the direction of collaborative. But the point I wanted to make is this isn't just about universities, it's about individuals. We've had very much a culture of the leader, the individual, the PI, the person who wins the grant. And I think an awful lot of research now is not about individuals, it's about teams. And I know that Otto Leisler, leading UKRI, is very keen that we recognise those teams. And they aren't always the academic leader. I've experienced many an occasion when we could not have done our research without the superb technician or the research nurse who's delivering the clinical trial to patients, or the engineer who's helping with something. And I think a wider recognition of what's often called team science is, I think, is going to be more important. So it's not just, the leader on the white horse at the front with with the people coming behind him, it is about recognizing those diversity of skills, which, let's face it, if we're going to tackle big problems, whether they're fundamental discovery problems, you know, what differentiates a cell when it's going to become, you know, a skin cell or a brain cell or whatever else, still a fundamental question, or tackling COVID and climate change, these are going to need teams of people with different skills and with different backgrounds. And I hope we can go more down that route.
Thank you very much, Nancy. And I don't know if Gavin is able to put a link into the chat for the FST session that was held just a couple of weeks ago with Ottilien Eliza. And she had a lovely slide which was about the research ecosystem, really broadly defined, which was everybody from you know, the researcher at the bench, or you know, the type of work they were doing, but the technician, and as she called it, the person making the tea as well. So that really wide diversity of everyone who's needed to make the system work. We're coming into the last few minutes, and there is one more question that I'm really keen that we do pick up, and actually it builds on what Nancy's just been saying there, which is about diversity and inclusion. And I know that's certainly a priority for Ottilien Eliza as well. And a question about, could you speak to the diversity and inclusion agenda, and in particular, the role of universities in engaging with movements such as Black Lives Matter. Tim, what's Strathclyde doing on this area?
Thanks. Yeah, I think this is something that we all have to very clearly reflect on. We've around equality, diversity, and inclusion. We've one of the universities that has a big grant from EPSRC, which is looking specifically about how we adjust research practices and learn from best practices in other places about supporting colleagues who are coming in with different kinds of backgrounds and different sorts of family circumstances. I think that, you know, and I'm particularly aware that during the lockdown, this is something where our thinking has developed hugely. We've got to recognise that people are affected differently by the circumstances. And as an example to that, during the whole lockdown period, as a university, we decided that we would make Friday an extra day's rest. So these were rest days which were introduced in recognition of the way working at home was going to affect people's working practices and their ability to cope with the kinds of stresses that they had. Now that's one example. But again, as we start to think about the way we respond to you know, providing extra support to people dealing with the current situation, again, this is pushing us very strongly into a different way of thinking, I think, where you're recognizing the home pressures that can affect people differentially, whether that's women, whether that's people who are you know, in family circumstances or in different social circumstances, trying to find ways of making that help practical and making a difference to those, so that it's not just a way of finding a convenient policy statement, but that you're also finding a set of actions that you can do which actually make a difference to those individuals in these different circumstances. And I think that's something that has to happen at quite a detailed level, because people's circumstances are so very different. So maybe that's a contribution to this debate, I think. Thanks,
Tim. I'll just come briefly to David, and then I'm going to give Nancy the last word before we wrap up. David.
Yeah, so I mean, like many universities at the time, we put out a statement of support and some commitments, and we're going to be held to those commitments, as should at a university. But it also does ask a question about diversity and inclusion within university structures, at senior leadership all the way down. And we've launched a decolonization program, and it's not about decolonizing the curriculum. So I mean, that's I think everyone's thinking that's a given, but it's more about looking at our processes, interviews, and the panel composition. You know, at all the various stages, do we have the right balance, particularly for a university like ours, where over 50% of our students are BAME. So it's yes, we have to address those specific promises that were made for BLM, but there's a bigger issue about our sector, how we address inclusivity and ethnicity at senior management as well.
Thank you very much, David. Nancy.
So yeah, every university, I think, is working really, really hard now on everything from unconscious bias training, mentoring, supporting, advising, guiding, trying to widen the pool of applicants, whether it's ethnic diversity, gender diversity, many other forms of diversity. And I think Black Map Lives Matter has been a wake up to step up on each of those things. But the last thing I wanted to say, actually, if that's okay, and I'm sure you'll want to wrap up, is first of all, it's been great to have this discussion. But secondly, I mean, there've been a lot of questions. We haven't managed to answer all of them. And certainly I'm personally very happy if there are questions that we didn't have time to answer. If you want to email them to me, and I'll reply to them as best I can by email. But thank you from me anyway.
Thank you very much, Nancy. And let me thank all our panelists. So Professor Dame Nancy Rothwell, our keynote speaker, our 4 other panelists, Professor David Umber, Professor Tim Bedford, Professor Helen Dodd, and Dr. Benjamin Litchman. As Nancy said, there were an awful lot of questions, and thank you to all of you for all the questions and all that thinking that's been stimulated. I hope there'll be a bit of time to get to some of the questions in the breakout discussions that Gavin's going to tell us about shortly. But you've got a very generous offer there from Nancy, and I saw some of the other panelists nodding as well to actually come back to some of these really important issues. It's been a very, very wide-ranging session, I think an absolutely stimulating one. So thank you again to all our panelists and keynote speakers for their contributions, and I'll hand back to Gavin.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you very much to the whole panel. I think it's been a great day, and all the participants have the email address from the Foundation for Science and Technology, so we will certainly take up the offer to pass on unasked questions to people. So please do send those questions through to us, and we'll pass them on. Now it's your chance to discuss the things that you've heard and other things related to today. As in the last couple of days, we're going to break you up into groups, and you will find a host according to one of these 3 groupings, and depending on exactly who's there, then we'll break you into other groups after that. But to do that, we'll have to finish this meeting. I should say for participants, if you're not joining the breakout groups, don't be surprised. You will still get a questionnaire survey from us this afternoon asking you about today's event, and in fact the whole week's event, so please do fill that in if you can. So we're going to stop this meeting now in order for you to be able to start again in 1 minute's time in our breakout groups. So on behalf of the Foundation, thank you very much, and we will see you very soon. Bye.